The courtroom was packed. Rows of spectators stretched all the way to the door, their faces tense and expectant in the oppressive dimness of the hall. The old, flickering lights emitted a low hum, casting a weak glow over the polished wooden benches. The air was thick, heavy with hushed whispers and held breaths. Something in the atmosphere suggested that what was about to happen would not be just another routine trial. Not subscribed yet? Join our community by clicking subscribe and turn on the bell to receive a notification every time we upload a new video. On the bench, Judge Richard Holloway drummed his fingers impatiently on the dark wood of his desk. A man in his 60s, with silver hair and a face deeply lined from years of delivering relentless judgments. To him, every day in court was an endless parade of blurred faces, insignificant names, cases without value. Each trial was just a formality, a routine before lunch. But that day, though he didn't know it yet, his life was about to change. At the defense table, Danielle Carter sat with her back straight, her face impassive. She wore a perfectly tailored navy blue suit, her black hair neatly pulled into a bun. Her presence was firm, almost imposing, though Judge Holloway didn't even bother to give her a second glance. To him, she was just another woman sitting in the defendant's seat, just another person who had made a mistake and was now looking for excuses. His smirk widened as he flipped through the case file in front of him. There was no need to read further. He didn't need to hear her version of events. He already had his verdict in mind. "Well, well," he muttered mockingly, loud enough for the entire courtroom to hear. Another person who thinks the law doesn't apply to them. Scattered chuckles echoed in the courtroom. An uneasy murmur ran through the jury. The prosecutor, a young man in a grey suit, pressed his lips together, but said nothing. No one dared challenge Judge Holloway in his own court, but Danielle Carter didn't react. Not a single muscle in her face moved. She didn't flinch, didn't show anger, not even discomfort. Instead, a faint smile appeared on her lips. It wasn't the smile of someone who was nervous. It was the smile of someone who knew something. The others didn't. Judge Holloway leaned forward, savoring his own performance. "Let me guess," he said with a sarcastic tone. "You're here to say you were wrongfully arrested? That this is all just a big misunderstanding?" More laughter rippled through the courtroom. But then, for the first time, Danielle spoke. "With all due respect, Your Honor." Her voice was calm, calculated. "I prefer to stick to the facts rather than waste time with opinions." The judge blinked. For a brief second, his smirk faltered. Something about the way she spoke, her tone, made him feel an unexpected unease. He cleared his throat and looked at her with skepticism. "Facts?" he repeated with irony. "All right, Miss Carter, let's hear your facts." Danielle exhaled slowly and slipped a hand into her blazer. A small, almost insignificant gesture, but the bailiff in the room tensed immediately, his hand instinctively moving toward his belt. On the bench, Holloway gave a condescending smirk. "Oh, don't tell me you're about to do something stupid," he said, amused by his own joke. But when Danielle pulled out a small black leather case and opened it on the table, the entire courtroom held its breath. Inside the case, gleaming under the dim light, was a golden badge with bold engraved letters. Judge Holloway felt the air leave his chest. The prosecutor dropped his pen, his eyes wide as saucers. The silence became unbearable. Click subscribe and turn on notifications. That way, you'll always stay up to date with our latest videos and won't miss a thing. Danielle placed the case on the table with deliberate calm, as if she were revealing her winning hand in a poker game. "My name," she said, her voice firm and unwavering, "is Special Agent Danielle Carter, United States Secret Service." For a moment, time seemed to freeze. The small black case rested on the defense table, open, displaying the gleaming gold badge. The engraved letters were unmistakable: United States Secret Service. It wasn't just any badge. It wasn't just another medal. It was a symbol of authority, of power, of something far greater than anyone in that courtroom had expected to face that day. Judge Holloway blinked rapidly, as if his eyes were deceiving him. His chest rose and fell with rapid breaths, but he tried to mask his surprise behind a facade of indifference. This couldn't be happening. The prosecutor, however, didn't have the same composure. He stood frozen, mouth agape, his hands trembling slightly as he flipped through the documents before him. How did he not know this? How had such a crucial detail been overlooked? His fingers moved back and forth over the pages, but the answer wasn't there. A murmur began to spread through the courtroom. Jury members exchanged uncertain glances. Some spectators in the back rows leaned forward, trying to get a closer look. The once oppressive silence now fractured into nervous whispers, as if everyone suddenly realized they were about to witness something far bigger than they had imagined. But Danielle Carter remained unfazed. Her expression didn't change. Her dark eyes stayed fixed on the judge, reading every minute shift in his face, the surprise, the confusion, and finally the fear. The judge tried to speak, but his throat was dry. He swallowed, wetted his lips, and raised his voice, less steady than he would have liked. What does this mean? Danielle tilted her head slightly, her gaze impenetrable. "It means, Your Honor," she said calmly, "that this trial is not what you thought it." Was. The prosecutor dropped his pen again. A couple of jurors leaned forward in their seats, eyes widening. Danielle slid the case to the center of the table, making sure everyone saw it. Then, just as calmly, she pulled another document from her bag. A sealed envelope with an official letterhead from the Department of Justice. "This," she continued, "is an official report detailing the multiple irregularities in my arrest, including, but not limited to, falsification of documents, excessive use of force, and the illegal detention of a federal agent on duty." A chill ran down Judge Holloway's spine. His fingers clutched the edge of the bench, his knuckles turning white. This couldn't be happening. Danielle slid the envelope across the table. "I understand that everyone in this courtroom assumed I was just another defendant," she said, her tone still measured. "After all, not even the officers who arrested me bothered to verify my identity before dragging me here." The murmurs in the room grew into a low roar. A wave of disbelief swept over those present. Judge Holloway felt sweat gathering on his forehead. The control he once had over the courtroom, over the trial, over his own image, was crumbling before his eyes. Danielle took a deep breath and continued. "But what I find truly concerning," she said, pausing deliberately, "is that even without knowing my identity, you had already passed judgment on me." The judge felt as if he had been punched in the stomach. "Your Honor," the prosecutor said, quickly rising to his feet, "in light of this new information, the state requests that all charges against Agent Carter be dropped immediately." Judge Holloway pressed his lips into a thin, tense line. He looked at the official seal on the envelope Danielle had placed on the table, then at the badge. He knew there was no way out. He took a deep breath and struck the gavel against the wood, his voice barely a murmur. Case dismissed. But that day, for the first time in his career, it wasn't his voice that silenced the room. Danielle calmly gathered her documents, pushing her chair back. The entire courtroom watched her in silence, expectant. She walked with steady steps toward the door, but before leaving she stopped. Without fully turning around, her voice carried just enough for everyone to hear. "Next time." Her words were slow, deliberate. "Think before you laugh." And, with that, she crossed the threshold. Behind her, Judge Holloway sank into his seat, pale, his gaze vacant. He knew that after today, his career was over, because now the whole world would know what had happened. The echo of her footsteps resonated through the courthouse hallway as Danielle Carter walked away, leaving behind a pale judge, a trembling prosecutor, and a completely stunned jury. But even as she exited, her mind wasn't in that moment. It was in the past. She had learned to remain unfazed long before joining the Secret Service. She knew that real power wasn't in brute force or imposed authority. It was in absolute control over one's emotions. Detroit, 1998. The sound of sirens blended with the city's bustle. Danielle was only 14 years old the first time she saw her. Older brother handcuffed against the hood of a patrol car. "He didn't do anything," she screamed, her voice breaking with indignation. But the officers didn't even look at her. Her brother Marcus was 19, a good student, an athlete, and a black man in the wrong place at the wrong time. He was accused of a robbery he didn't commit, arrested without evidence, and beaten when he tried to defend himself. Danielle would never forget the look on his face when they put him in the car. It wasn't fear, it wasn't shock, it was resignation. As if he had known this was bound to happen sooner or later, he spent 2 years in prison before the real culprit confessed. But by the time Marcus was released, he was no longer the same. And justice never came. That was when Danielle made a decision. She wasn't going to be a victim. She wasn't going to stand by and do nothing. If she wanted justice, she would find it from the inside. Years later, she graduated with honors in criminal law. She aced her exams with perfect scores. She was recruited by the FBI, but she wanted more. She wanted to be at the heart of the action, where the biggest decisions were made. The day she received her Secret Service badge, she held it in her hands for several minutes, thinking of Marcus. "It's different now," she told herself. "Now I have the power." The courtroom remained silent long after Danielle had left. Judge Holloway sat stiffly, unable to process what had just happened. His career, his reputation, his authority, everything was crumbling in real time. "Your Honor." The prosecutor's voice was barely a whisper. "What do we do now?" Holloway didn't respond. He knew exactly what was going to happen. The courtroom cameras had captured every second. The footage would reach the news, the internet, the morning headlines. The humiliation was just the beginning. Hours later, his phone wouldn't stop ringing. Emails, calls from reporters, messages from former colleagues rushing to distance themselves from him. Within 24 hours, his name was everywhere. Judge exposed for racial bias and abuse of power in open court. Secret Service agent uncovers corruption in the judicial system. Danielle Carter, the woman who took on Judge Holloway and won television commentators, couldn't talk about anything else. Some rushed to defend him, claiming it was a misunderstanding. But the footage spoke for itself. It didn't take long for reports to surface about other cases where Holloway had handed down questionable rulings, ignored evidence, favored certain prosecutors. Cases that had been buried for years. But now they were coming to light. The final blow came when his own legal team handed him an official letter: resign or face a federal investigation. Holloway felt the air grow thick. He knew what that meant. There was no way out. The first leaks hit social media before the courthouse had even closed its doors that day. A discreetly recorded video from the public showed the exact moment Danielle Carter revealed her badge. It was shared thousands of times within hours. Racist judge humiliated in open court. Black woman wrongfully arrested. Turns out to be a Secret Service agent. Justice in reverse, when those who are supposed to protect you lock you up without evidence. The headlines varied, but the impact was the same. By the next day, the case was on every national news channel. Talk shows, legal experts, civil rights activists, former government agents, everyone had something to say. The more conservative outlets tried to discredit Danielle, claiming it was all an overblown misunderstanding. But no one could deny the footage. The live recording of the trial also began to go viral. The judge's pale face, the prosecutor's pen slipping from his fingers, the jury's silent, stunned reaction. Every second was analyzed over and over. And while the world talked about her, Danielle Carter remained silent. Not even 48 hours had passed before Danielle's office received a high-level notification. A committee from the Department of Justice was requesting her presence immediately. When she entered the meeting room, they were already there. 4 men in dark suits with tense expressions. Among them, the Deputy Director of the Secret Service and a representative from the Attorney General's office. "Agent Carter, have a seat." Danielle didn't flinch. She wasn't surprised. She knew that this level of public exposure never went unnoticed. Her testimony had been explosive, too much so, and people in power did not tolerate unpredictability. The Secret Service director leaned forward slightly. "We need you to keep a low profile for now." Danielle raised an eyebrow. "A low profile? This has escalated too quickly," another man interjected. "People are asking questions they shouldn't be asking. They want to know how many other cases like this we've let slip through the cracks." Danielle narrowed her eyes. "And what's the problem with that?" The Attorney General sighed. "The problem, Agent Carter, is that you're exposing the system at a very delicate time." Danielle let out a sharp, ironic laugh. "It's not the system that's in danger. It's the people who've been manipulating it for years." Silence. None of the men at the table denied it. Finally, the Secret Service director spoke again. "We will make sure Judge Holloway pays for what he's done. But you need to decide what role you want to play in this." Danielle rested her elbows on the table, clasping her hands together. "I didn't come here to make deals. I came to do my job." The prosecutor shot her a tense look. "That's the problem, Agent Carter. Right now, you're no longer just an agent. You're a symbol, and symbols can be dangerous." Danielle held his gaze. "They can also be unstoppable." No one responded, but she already knew this wouldn't be the last conversation of its kind. Meanwhile, elsewhere in the city, Judge Holloway sat in his office, phone in hand, its screen glowing with messages. Hundreds of them. "Resign before this gets worse. We're reviewing past cases, Richard. It doesn't look good for you. I can't be associated with you anymore. I'm sorry." Former colleagues, former friends, allies who now avoided him like a contagious disease. The fall had been swift. 3 days after the trial, internal documents about his sentencing history were leaked. His rate of unjustified convictions was alarmingly high, especially when the defendant was a person of color. Want more content like this? Then hit like, subscribe, and turn on notifications, because we always have new content, and you don't want to miss out. Protests erupted outside his office. "Holloway out. We demand real justice. No more corrupt judges." TV cameras followed him everywhere. Reporters surrounded his house. And then, the final blow. The FBI launched an official investigation into his career. That was when he realized there was no escape. The night before his hearing before the state Supreme Court, Holloway drafted his resignation. But his punishment didn't end there. When he shut down his computer and stood up from his chair, he saw his own reflection in the window. He looked older, more fragile. His whole life, he had believed that power made him untouchable. But that night, as he turned off the lights and walked out of his office for the last time, he understood something. One name, one face, had been enough to bring down everything he had built. Danielle Carter, and the world would never forget her. The morning after Judge Holloway's resignation, Danielle Carter woke up to her face on every screen. The headlines called her many things. The agent who took down a corrupt judge. A symbol of justice in uncertain times. Hero or threat to the judicial system. The debate over Danielle Carter. But she didn't feel like any of those things. She felt tired. On her desk, her Secret Service badge gleamed under the soft morning light. The same one she had shown in court, But now it felt heavier. Her phone vibrated. A message from her superior, "We need to talk," which meant that though she had won the battle in court, her war had only just begun. When Danielle entered the secret service headquarters that afternoon, she noticed the stares. Some colleagues looked at her with respect, others with resentment. "Carter, the director wants to see you." Danielle nodded and walked down the hallway to the office at the end. Inside, the director of the Secret Service, a woman with silver hair and a stern expression, stood with her arms crossed. "Close the door." Danielle did. The director took a deep breath and then fixed her with an intense gaze. "I don't know whether to congratulate you or warn you, Carter." Danielle arched an eyebrow. "Warn me?" The director slid a file across the table. "The Holloway case has cracked the system open. Now there's pressure to review past sentences. Federal investigations are being launched. Some call it a victory. Others see it as a threat." Danielle opened the file. Inside were names, photos, other judges, other cases. There are people who want you to keep going, to use your position to expose more corruption. And there are others who'd rather I stay quiet. The director held her gaze. "I don't need to tell you what happens to people who make too much noise in the wrong places." Danielle smirked. "If I were afraid, I wouldn't have made it this far." The director sighed. "That's what I thought." She folded her arms and leaned on the desk. "You have two choices, Carter. You can accept a promotion, transfer to another unit, leave this case behind. Or you can keep going and become something bigger. But if you choose the latter, be ready for war." Danielle closed the file. She already knew her answer. That night, as Danielle left the building, her phone rang. An unknown number. She answered. "Carter." The deep voice was immediately familiar. "Judge Holloway." Silence. "Don't call me that," he said, his voice tired. "I'm not a judge anymore." Danielle didn't reply. "I hope you're satisfied," Holloway continued. "They've destroyed me. I've lost everything." Danielle clenched her jaw. "You didn't lose anything you hadn't earned." Holloway let out a bitter laugh. "I'm not the only one like me, Carter. You know there are plenty more. Do you really think this changes anything?" Danielle took a deep breath. "I don't think I know." Holloway said nothing. Danielle walked to her car and rested a hand on the door. "Let me tell you something, ex-judge. The difference between you and me is that I'm still standing. And you're already history." And with that, she hung up. She didn't look back. Days later, Danielle Carter received an official notice. She was offered a new position, lead investigator in a newly formed division focused on uncovering judicial corruption. It was a rare opportunity, a position that didn't exist before her case, a real change, but not everyone wanted her there. In the shadows, enemies were gathering, and Danielle knew it, but she didn't care. She looked at herself in the mirror before leaving her office. She looked exactly the same as always, but something inside her had changed. She was more than just an agent now. She was a symbol, and symbols don't fade so easily. As Danielle Carter walked through the streets of Washington, D.C., she felt the eyes on her, some filled with admiration, others with doubt, and some with resentment. The Holloway case had turned into a media storm. Spontaneous protests were erupting outside courthouses across the country. People were sharing their own stories of injustice, demanding change, demanding that more judges be investigated. No more Holloways. The movement was growing, but Danielle knew the backlash against her was growing too. She received the first anonymous email that morning. "Stop digging where you don't belong." Then more came. "We know where you live. Don't mess with the system or you'll regret it." She wasn't surprised. She knew this came with the territory. But what truly made her pause was a call that came into her office. "Agent Carter, there's someone on the line insisting on speaking with you." "Who is it?" They wouldn't give their name, but they said it was important. Danielle took a breath before accepting the call. "Carter?" The voice was rough, unfamiliar. "Who is this?" Someone who has worked inside the system for a long time, longer than you can imagine. Danielle narrowed her eyes. And what do you want? There was a pause. To warn you, what you did with Holloway, that was just the beginning. You've put people at risk, people with much more power than him. If they feel at risk, Danielle responded calmly, it's because they know they've done something wrong. The man chuckled, but there was no humor in it. Kid, the problem isn't who's guilty. The problem is who has the power to make you disappear. Click. The call ended. Danielle stared at the phone for a long moment. She wasn't afraid, but she knew this was far from over. That night, before heading home, Danielle did something she hadn't done in years. She got in her car and drove to Detroit. She pulled up in front of a modest house, its paint worn by time. The house she had grown up in. There, standing in the doorway, was her mother, waiting for her with a mix of pride and concern. You don't have to do this, Danny. Danielle walked up and embraced her. I have to, Mom. They sat on the porch, just like they used to when Danielle was a child. Marcus would be proud of you, her mother said softly. Danielle felt a lump form in her throat. Her brother, the real reason she had taken this path. Sometimes I wonder what he'd say if he were here. Her mother took her hand. He'd tell you not to let them take away what you've accomplished. To keep going. Danielle nodded. Then that's what I'll do. While Danielle found strength in her family, Judge Holloway was drowning in his worst nightmare. He could no longer step outside without being hounded by the press. The allies he once had in power had completely abandoned him. We need you to formally surrender your judicial license, they told him over the phone. If you do, we might help you avoid prison. Prison? The word sent a chill through him. He had never imagined he would be on the other side of the system. His house was empty. His wife had left him. His children no longer called. He was completely alone. That night, he turned on the TV and saw Danielle Carter being interviewed in prime time. This case isn't just about me, she was saying, her voice firm. It's about every person who has been silenced by a system that protects the corrupt. Holloway turned off the TV in anger. Everything he had built was gone, and the worst part was that it was his own fault. Back in Washington, Danielle received an official notification in her inbox. Meeting with the Attorney General. Subject, new Federal Justice Unit. She knew what it meant. The government couldn't ignore what she had done. Some people wanted to use her as a positive example. Others wanted to quietly get rid of her. But Danielle Carter was never someone who was easily silenced. Before leaving her office that night, she stared at her reflection in the window. She knew this was only the beginning. The real fight was just getting started. She took a deep breath, grabbed her coat, and stepped into the night, ready for whatever came next. If this story inspired you, leave a like to support the channel and subscribe for more content like this. Don't forget to turn on notifications so you won't miss the next chapters. And let us know where you're watching from. We love hearing from every corner of the world our channel reaches.